what is Genesis 6? What is this seed war? And tie all of this together for people who are really trying to figure this out. So the first question that I have for you is, can you start by explaining who the Nephilim are and a little bit about Genesis 6? So in other words, were they the offspring of fallen angels? How did this whole narrative go down, and what is the narrative?
Is it okay if I start at Genesis 3?
Yes, you can. Okay. I'll make that question. We'll move it up a little bit.
Okay. Because again, the my world, not only again in academia, but just as a pastor teaching every week, multiple times, when you're teaching a text, the key word, and even the youth group, I've been a youth pastor forever, and they're like, yeah, we know, context.
Yes.
Like, yes.
Okay.
So the context of Genesis 6 begins at Genesis 3.
Yes.
And so because there's a lot of history there that happens in just a few short chapters. And so it's interesting too, that if anybody just jumps into Genesis 6, they're going to, even scholars would be like, they have to come to the point of going, what was Moses, if Moses is the writer, which I traditionally, I think he is.
Yep.
But why did he just bring this out of nowhere? It seems like he just brought this out of nowhere. And then he's assuming a certain level of understanding by his audience as it relates to the sons of God, that term, or even the Nephilim themselves, which appear in Genesis 6:4. So, but if we go back to Genesis 3, what we see in just a short section of scripture, again, that covers at least 1,600 years, some, depending on your chronology, 2,000 years, is you see this figure. The Hebrew word is nachash. It's the idea of a shining one, a serpentine figure. He shows up there. God allows it. God sets up this. Again, God could have just flicked them away. God could have set up a barrier. God could have done a lot of things, but he chose not to.
Right.
So he allows the nachash to show up and to tempt, to challenge, to test Adam and Eve. Specifically, he appropriated it through Eve at first. And what you see there is God's response. So obviously, we know that in the story, Adam and Eve chose wrongly.
Yep.
And then when God confronts each of them, when he confronts Satan, or which we would believe is Satan, or the serpent there, he says specifically that I'm going to cause enmity between you and the woman.
Yep.
Genesis 3:15.
Yep.
And so there you have the woman now, which is interesting. He didn't say it was the man, but he says between your seed, the woman's seed, and then the seed of the serpent. And so what you have there, and many people, and this is the key, and this is the debate all the time, is how are things literal? Are they figurative? Are they allegorical?
Yes.
And I think there's no reason to put on the text this is anything but a narrative. It's a straightforward narrative. There's been a lot of linguistic studies showing there's a big difference with how Hebrew narrative works rather than, let's say, Hebrew poetry. If you're looking at something allegorical, and people can look that up, but there was a great study done that compared the Hebrew verbs of Genesis really 1 and 2 versus Psalm 104, which is a creation hymn.
Yep.
And it's clearly different. And so to say that Genesis 3 or Genesis 1 and 2 is allegorical is just simply not based on linguistics. So sorry to say that for anybody. But the point being is this: the key there is God is making this juxtaposition between the seed, the zerah of the serpent, and the zerah of the woman. Well, most scholars would recognize clearly that the zerah of the woman is referring to the future messianic person.
That's right.
The Messiah figure. This is the proto-evangelium. This is the first time that you get a hint of the gospel. And so she understood that too in Genesis 4, that from her physical genetics would come forth this future messianic figure, which would crush the head of the serpent. The seed of the serpent would bruise this figure's heel. So now you have the woman and Satan. The seed of the woman is what we call the Messiah, Jesus, and the seed of Satan is most likely some level of the Antichrist figure, in the future. And that becomes important when we talk about eschatology. But nevertheless, again, this is the big picture, or this is the 10,000-foot view, in that Moses brings us through God right there in the beginning this war. This is why people call it the seed war. The
seed war.
Because you have the two seeds being mentioned. One is the physical seed representative of Jesus, and most likely, if we're going to be consistent, why would we just all of a sudden make the seed of the serpent being figurative? That would be really odd to do that within the same verse. So the seed war has begun here of this battle of you have a supernatural. Satan was a supernatural. He intervened into the life of humanity supernaturally. He showed up. And so when you come to the rest of Genesis, when you go to into Genesis 4, you have certainly Cain and Abel, and you have the lines there. What I mean is you have them fighting and Abel being killed. And then you have some other genetic markers and genealogical lines. Getting into Genesis 5, we see there the line of Adam all the way to Noah. So then when you get to Genesis 6, again, what right out of the gate, we see Moses writing that, hey, by the way, I just gave you some history. A lot of things that happened in Genesis 4 in the sense of Cain, the story of Cain. Let me just step back for a minute because this is important.
Yeah.
Cain goes out and he finds a woman. And people say, well, hey, where did she come from? Well, don't assume that we're having this very tight chronology that as soon as Adam and Eve fell, they were kicked out of the garden, and she has a child, and she has Cain and Abel there in Genesis 4, that this is somehow descriptive in a sequence of everything that has happened. We know Genesis 5, verse 4, that Adam and Eve have many sons and daughters.
Yes.
And so by the time, the way that so often we read Genesis 4 and we're like, oh, well, the next thing happened, and maybe Cain was like 15 years old and Abel was maybe 12. And so you have these two boys. I don't think that's the case at all. You could have centuries that have gone by in Genesis 4. And in fact, I think it's pretty obvious that this is the case because as Cain goes out and he kills his brother subsequently, later he goes out and he's worried about others killing him. Well, who are these others? These aren't a separate race. These are all descendants of Adam and Eve. And so you had centuries, I think, that went by where you had these other civilizations or cities or others growing up. So ultimately, Cain finds one of his nieces, one of his sisters. When you're living a long time, what's the birth range of a woman who's living 700 years?
Whoa.
I mean, she's
is a long time.
You could have 50, 60, 80 kids. Who knows? 100 kids. Yep. And multiply that out just in a few generations, you would have hundreds and hundreds of people. So when we get to Genesis 6, you have 1,500 years to 2,000 years of history that has already taken place. So the humanity has multiplied. And that's exactly what the text says, is that, by the way, you had when the children of men, when humanity began to multiply. And maybe what we should do is, are you willing to read Genesis 6?
I have it open. Yeah, I have it open. Yeah. Okay. Where do you want me to start?
People can get a nice flavor for the flow here of what it's saying, and then we can zero in on Genesis 6:4.
Absolutely. Okay. So, and this is just the NIV translation, just so people know, but when human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful and they married any of them that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Do you want me to keep going?
So go to verse 5.
Okay. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil at the time.
Okay, so if we see several things here in the passage where Moses is bringing up the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, very specific phrase. We can talk about that. But right here at the beginning, he talks about the daughters of Adam, the daughters of humanity. He contrasts the daughters of humanity being beautiful with these sons of God figure. So in Old Testament, my master's degree is in Old Testament. And so, I study certainly a lot of Old Testament theology and archaeology and other things, but you see various views on Genesis 6. And I would say that the predominant view is the Hebrew scholars, they know that this isn't referring to humans in the sense of the sons of God are not humans. But some of the theories are that, I'll just give them to you. one of them, we'll talk about the Sethites in a minute, but
Okay.
one of them is that, these were just humans that were went outside of their social status. That these sons of God were human rulers or judges that looked at the daughters of humanity and married outside their social customs. Okay, well, that's
I have not actually heard that.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's one of the views.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
It doesn't.
It doesn't jive. It definitely does not jive. No, it does
But
not.
they're trying, because
yeah, I get it.
If you go to the text and you try to find something that is a non-supernatural view, you're going to be creative, and you're going to try to look for things in the Mesopotamian context, the Near Eastern context. Another view is that these are human dynastic rulers, and so these are kings that are taking on for themselves the label as being a son of God, which was very typical, let's say, in the time of the Egyptians and Pharaoh. The Pharaoh always considered himself as to be a son of God. And so what the scholars are doing is saying, oh, well, here it is. This is a human, just a human taking on the claim or the title of a son of God. But then you say, but he's looking, these figures are looking at the daughters of humanity. Well, that seems odd. Why daughters of humanity?
Yeah.
That seems, again, really strange. These are just, if they're human, but they're making a title that they don't deserve as being God, these are they're at an equal level. So that doesn't really jive as well. Another view, which is probably the most common today, is that this is the godly line of Seth. Mm-hmm. And the godly line of Seth is marrying the daughters of Cain.
Right.
And so, but it doesn't say Cain. And so there's a lot of problems with this as well. I'll give you a few. I'll give you a few problems with the Sethite view, because the reason why is this is important, because when you go out and talk to somebody, they go, "Oh yeah, we know what Genesis 6. This is the godly line of Seth marrying the ungodly daughters of Cain." And you go, "Okay, did you learn that from somebody, or did you read the text and get that yourself?"
Right. That's the $1 million question, I feel like. Yeah.
Because when you just read this without any sort of presuppositions, you're not going to walk away with this at all. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to walk away with complete understanding just at face value, but first of all, it doesn't. When the sons of God, they're not called Sethite. The word the Sethites don't appear anywhere in here. The word Cain, as it relates to Cain's daughters, don't appear anywhere in here.
No, you have to inject that into the text if you're going to go with that as an explanation for this passage.
Yep. And what often they will say is, well, if you look at the context of Genesis 5 and Genesis 4, you see in Genesis 5 the line of Seth going down all the way to Noah. That's true. I don't disagree with that. You see the line of Cain appearing in Genesis 4. That is true, very clear. But when you come to Genesis 6, do those things flow directly in with any sort of reasonability? And the answer is no. Secondly, there's a lot of assumptions there. Since when does spirituality become determined through genetic lines? So in this case, the sons of God, the godly line is only the children of Seth. And the wicked are only the line of Cain.
Okay, yeah.
Well, when did we? Does any theologian today think that spirituality is determined by genetic lines? That would be really problematic in a whole bunch of other ways.
Yes, that would affect a lot of doctrines we have,
wouldn't it? It would be irrecoverable, honestly, if someone really was to press that, especially with the New Testament understanding that we have.
Absolutely.
Because John 1:12 says very clear, we didn't become born again through genetic lines or through blood. The other thing, too, is what you see there is an emphasis in Genesis 6:4 on the Nephilim, these men of renown, these people of renown from ancient times is literally what it says.
Yep.
We shouldn't get stuck on the word men necessarily, even though we could talk about that. But they're Me'olam. They're from ancient times. They had a reputation. They were men of name.
Yeah,
is really literally what it says. So, okay, but secondly, so you have as well that these Nephilim, the word appears in Numbers 13:33 as being a reference to these giants, these giant people. Okay. Well, again, if we go back to, well, it's the line of Seth and the line of Cain. Since when does spiritual incompatibility create physical characteristics such as giantism? That's nowhere to be found. That an unbeliever and a believer getting married, now you're going to have something strange genetically. That doesn't fit at all. The label of only the women of Cain being wicked doesn't say anything about them wicked. The only description it gives is that they're beautiful. Okay, that's a marker. The marital prohibitions of between believers and unbelievers. There's no marital prohibitions given in the first chapters. That doesn't come until later under the law. We'll also say too, is it's interesting here that, again, linguistically speaking, that the term B'nai Ha Elohim, sons of God, literally sons of the God. It's a very specific phrase. If anybody has computer software, I mean, it's really nice because my computer software, I just highlight the phrase in Hebrew, right click, and I say search for the phrase. Boom, it just whips every place it appears. And when it appears, again, Genesis 6:2, Genesis 6:4, and then also in Job 1:2 and Job 38. Okay, so those are the only places that it appears. Well, in the book of Job, the scholars there recognize quite clearly that this is referring to some sort of group of supernatural beings. Call them angels. The Old Testament does not call them angels. That's very clear. The New Testament does in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6. But the Hebrew does not. So all we know is that you have a different, you have this group, this non-human group. Now that's interesting to me. If we understand, and I'm not saying either, let me say this, that it's wise at times to take other writings, let's say the book of Job, how it uses a certain Hebrew word, and force it back on another writer. Okay, but we can look for consistency, but we're not saying it's forced. But what do we see here in Genesis 6:2? We see a contrast between two groups. One is the sons of God, and the others is the daughters of humanity. Now, if you just let it speak for itself, you go, well, why the daughters of humanity? Why would it say that? Why doesn't it say the daughters of Cain? Because what it's doing here, what Moses is saying is, hey, everyone, what I'm telling you right now is that you have a group of non-human beings looking at a female contingent or the female contingent of a different race, which is humans. So now you have these two groups, this supernatural non-human group looking at human women and seeing that they're beautiful. Now, let me bring another thing here too, which is context. And this happens to be the theological context, in that oftentimes in our brains, we're reading Genesis 1-5 or 1-6, and we import ourselves into the time of the flood. That's reasonable. I mean, I want to be in there, right?
Definitely.
Okay.
Nothing like being in a good story. That is for sure. Yeah.